All right.
Recording on. Well, good afternoon. Next to last webcast for this academic year. What guided my selection of a subject for today is the project that's been occupying me by far the most over the last year, and that's writing my book. And in one of the sections of the book, I'm now up to part 4, I decided to take some of the cases that I had gotten interested in, cases in the public eye in years past, and sought out all the literature I could get on the case, and in one case actually met with members of the family, which is the Kaczynski case, the Unabomber, and that's the first case I've written up. So I'm going to talk today about the Unabomber case. I first presented this, I think, almost 20 years ago, maybe as many as 20 years ago. And so in going back, I had to review a lot of material that I had saved, including records from the Federal Public Defender's Office, and thought some of the pieces made a little more sense to me about how to say them. So I'll be particularly pleased if you give me feedback today on what works, doesn't work for you in this presentation, what's useful, what isn't, and the overall impression about what I put together. I'm going to begin with 2 quotes that actually come from another case. I'm going to present a book of another case, which was The Executioner's Song. That's the one about Gary Gilmore. And in the preface to Executioner's Song, a man named Dave Eggers said 2 things which I'd like to read, because I believe they're relevant to trying to understand, and the public's effort to understand people like the Unabomber and Gary Gilmore, as well as Adam Lanza, which will be the 3rd case that I work on in this section. So here's the 2 quotes. "The terrible and exasperating thing about humans is how goodness and gentleness, and utter depravity and disregard for human life can be contained within the same person and in terrifyingly close proximity." The 2nd quote, "Good God, it would be easier if this were not the case. If murderers were of a wholly different species, if they were beasts who we couldn't talk to, relate to, understand in any way, if they were incapable of love or light, it would be far easier. But this is not the case. They are almost always people precisely like ourselves, flawed and good and weak, capable of acts of courage and horrible mistakes." Excuse me one sec. So I thought that was really good stuff he was writing. He was connected with Gary Gilmore, who fit that model, and to a significant extent, Kaczynski does. And I think one of the core ideas in Bowen theory is that people and families are pretty much alike, more alike than different, but exist on this spectrum of adaptive capacity. So, as we all know, hardly a day goes by that tragedies of the nature of one person doing seemingly senseless and serious harm to another person or people are not in the news. And most of the cases probably don't even make the news. So questions about why a person has committed such heinous acts are routinely puzzled over in the reporting. Commonly, explanations such as traumatic childhood, severe mental illness, bad seed, or more recently, terrorism, are invoked as explanations. People feel confused if the offender's family background appears relatively normal. And so questions such as these often energize nature-nurture debates. So this is a subject very much, I think, in the public consciousness that rarely has answers. Now, Bowen theory is by no means a complete explanation for these cases. The complexity of the processes involved typically precludes that, but the lens of theory adds a great deal by revealing the hidden life of families, as I've titled this book. Journalists often describe these hidden processes very well, but lack the conceptual framework to clarify their importance. So you see in newspaper articles Bowen theory come alive in what they write, but of course the journalist is not clear exactly how these things play into the problem, although some journalists, of course, are very gifted in their insights. So another purpose in presenting cases like this, given that Kaczynski was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, complicated process, is to emphasize the reductionism of psychiatric labels. I wanted to present enough detail to sort of bring the man more alive in all his complexity. And it really can't be reduced to a simple diagnosis of schizophrenia, I don't believe, as the cause. So now I'll move into the Kaczynski case. 2 months after the FBI agents arrested Ted Kaczynski on the charge of being the Unabomber, and that was in April of '96, a long article published in the Washington Post about the Unabomber and his family triggered my interest in the case. Some of you may not know why he was referred to as the Unabomber. The FBI gave him that label because of the intended victims of his serial bombing attacks that he mailed usually were associated with universities or airlines. So they came up with Unabomber as their label for this, whoever the suspect was, and they had no idea at that point. So that article had a lot of very important detailed family interactions presented, which I found consistent with Bowen theory. It was one of those not uncommon cases in which a normal appearing family spawns a highly dysfunctional offspring. So I eventually, through a series of events, was able to meet with Ted Kaczynski's mother, Wanda, his younger brother, David, and David's wife, Linda. And that meeting occurred over a weekend in September 1997. I flew up to Schenectady, and we met at Mrs. Kaczynski's apartment. She had moved there from Chicago to be near her son David and his wife. So Ted Kaczynski, I corresponded with him a few times after he was incarcerated. It took a while for him to respond for some legal reasons. And our letter exchanges included some of my ideas about his family life and my ideas about how Bowen theory could help explain the family patterns that he described. He talked about his family, and I responded to that. To my knowledge, he took no interest in what I had to say. but he did send me a lot of material that he had written, and that was very helpful. Some will remember that the family was completely shocked by the revelations about Ted and his alleged crimes. No one in the family had connected Ted with the bombings until the Washington Post and New York Times published the Unabomber Manifesto in the early fall of 1995. David's wife, Linda Patrick, read the manifesto and urged her husband to read it, believing that the overall theme and numerous passages sounded like things Ted would write or had already written in letters to the family. She was the first to become suspicious that her brother-in-law could actually be the Unabomber. She talked to David. David looked at it and somewhat reluctantly agreed. It took him a while to really believe it, that she was correct. Then he went to his mother and told her about their suspicions, and with her agreement, he eventually notified the FBI. It was a difficult decision for the family to make, despite the high level of family tension that had characterized their interactions with Ted since he was an adolescent, and the considerable distance that had developed in recent years at Ted's insistence. He had remained a much beloved family member. I guess no surprise there. Now, briefly, the details. Between 1978 and 1995, and the FBI had no clue who this person was until David Kaczynski came to them with his suspicions. But he used explosive devices that he had constructed and sent through the mail to the targeted victims. Ted had killed 3 people and injured 23 others, some quite severely. So I wanted to see if Bowen theory could help explain what drove him to do what he did and how family relationships, including the multi-generational family, may have unwittingly contributed to such a dire outcome. I'm not suggesting that family emotional process causes the problem, but it is important for increasing the vulnerability for calamitous things like serial killing to happening. So I have the family diagram here, and a lot of this information I did get from the Federal Public Defender's Office, who were defending Kaczynski. And I don't put this in the book, but one of their mental health defenses is to research the family of origin and try to show how screwed up it is for several generations, and then use that to argue that this man is sort of a helpless victim of the family that he came from for whatever reasons. And they were intrigued by Bowen theory when they heard about the multi-generational aspect. So here's Ted's father, Ted Sr., although they have different middle names. He died in 1990. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer in September and killed himself with a gun shot to the head a month later. Wanda was 5 years younger than her husband, and in 1997, when I met with the family, she was 80, and she's still alive to this day. Ted was 55 at that point, born in 42, and here's David, almost 8 years younger, and his wife, Linda, and they don't have children. Wanda grew up in the Chicago area, and I didn't get everybody down there. Sorry about that. I made a mistake. She has a younger sister who was still alive and a younger brother who was still alive. But important to note about her family is her mother had a significant degree of dysfunction of her own with drug addiction and other problems, health problems she had. And her dad was kind of inept by description. These are various family members making these observations in dealing with all that. So Wanda became a very important figure in the family as a functional oldest daughter. This one was quite a behavioral actor-outer and went to reform school at some point in his middle teenage years. This baby died at birth, so she was the firstborn daughter. And it's very clear in what was written about her that her functioning position was strongly influenced by the significant impairment in her mother's function, who died at 17 of a stroke when Wanda would have been, died at 49 when Wanda would have been just 17. So much turmoil existed in that family, but even as a young girl, Wanda worked very hard to sort of right the ship. She was definitely fit the description of a parentified child, over-functioning in relationship to the chaos that she perceived in this family. So she was the functional oldest, and I think it very strongly contributed, in fact, she said as much, contributed to an attitude that when she had her own family, she would do absolutely everything she could to shape a family life that would make things turn out right for her kids, not and far removed from what she experienced growing up. This, of course, is not an unusual goal for a mother to have, but my impression in meeting Wanda and listening to her talk about it and some of the things that she did, I think she pursued it with unusually high energy and sense of purpose. A diagram that I'm not shown on the diagram that I'm actually putting in the book. These families, all these folks were born in Poland and came to the United States. And all these folks were born in the United States. So Wanda and Ted Sr. were second generation. They worked, so that was an important part of the family process to understand, I think, her functioning position. I have a little less data on the father, but he, as we'll talk about, clearly was the outsider in that parental triangle with Ted. So I think this data about the multi-generational family and what I would say it suggests is at the lower end of the moderate range of differentiation, down about 30, you may be ranging 30 to 35 various members, which I think suggests that there's consistent with David coming out of that, Ted coming out of that family system with a low level of self. It didn't come up from nowhere. And that was one of the things that lawyers wanted me to present in court, actually, if it got that far, which I was reluctant to do, that his level of self, without me ever meeting him, could be understood, and his vulnerability to mental illness could be understood in the context of what we knew about the families that Wanda, his mother, and Ted Sr. came from. And then David, as we'll talk about, was a little freer and definitely developed as a more functional sibling. Not perfect by a long shot. But one of the things that intrigued me about this family was it had the same set of dynamics, really, only fewer kids than my family. And I felt like I sort of knew it like the back of my hand. And when I went up to Schenectady to meet with the family, I started my time with them by talking about my own family, which got things off on a really solid footing, no defensiveness, and people were real interested in talking. So I next drew a timeline with a multitude of dates, partly drawn from the Federal Public Defender's record, but a lot of this now is in the public domain, not all of it. But in showing the timeline, I make the same point I'm trying to make in talking about my own family, that changes in the context of the family and the overall social context over time, how those changes correlate with changes in individual functioning of family members. And we'll come back to this with Ted, because he had a period when he was doing remarkably well. And there were no bombings, and as far as I know, no thoughts of bombings during that time. And we'll come back to my thinking about that. Some of you may remember this. The first significant event occurred very early in Ted's life. He was hospitalized at the age of 9 months. And this event seems to have had a more lasting impact on his mother, really, than on Ted. Ted had a severe allergic reaction, manifesting in hives over much of his body, and was confined for 6 days in a pediatric isolation unit in a hospital, which meant he couldn't spend a lot of time with his parents. And this is obviously a very difficult situation for any child to endure, but Mrs. Kaczynski believes, really to this day, I think it's more than a level of speculation. It really has been a significant thing in her life, a significant attitude, that Ted likely suffered lasting psychological trauma from that separation experience. An idea consistent, with a lot of the literature that was out there on attachment theory and psychoanalytic theory at that time. And she thinks that may explain why Ted developed a mental illness, which they want to put forth in his defense to diminish his responsibility for the actions he took. He was mentally ill, that's why he did it. And that was a plan for the trial, even though Ted didn't want it. I mean, if you read about her, it's clear and meet her, she desperately wanted Ted to have a normal life, but any signs of that not happening reinforced her speculation about the trauma notion. As a child, if Ted seemed angry or in some psychological pain, or if he withdrew, stopped speaking and making eye contact for a period of time, the fear was reawakened in her. It was always there, always in the background. She later extended the trauma explanation to why he had so few friends growing up and never had a girlfriend. She put a lot of energy in to trying to draw him out, wanting to know what was bothering him. The battle to understand Ted went on for years, said one journalist. She tried to lure neighborhood children to her home in the hope that Ted would begin to form some friendships. Wanda was fiercely dedicated to assuring Ted's well-being. I mean, this came across so strongly in the first article I read. So the information available about the family life indicates a powerful emotional fusion, I would say, and we'll come back to this, between Wanda and Ted, and a very active family projection process was supported by David and the father, supporting her in her anxiety-driven focus on the child. And at first, it seemed to basically be going well, but eventually she became more and more worried about delays in social development, impairment in his social development, no friends, no girlfriends, etc. Interestingly, Ted grew up, in his own words, feeling superior and special, like he was the most important member of the family. In terms of the impact he had on the emotional life of the family, he was the most important. Few cases are as clear that the family really was in orbit around Ted. Focus, focus, focus on Ted, not just Wanda, but the whole group. I saw Ted interviewed on YouTube. This interview was done in 1999 when he was in prison. And he said he got more attention from his parents than David did. That statement interested me because he later said, or had written earlier, actually, that he didn't feel like he had much connection with his mother at all. But at the same time, he's describing all this attention that was on him in the family. And I think that sense of specialness contributed to a kind of arrogance and license to be able to do whatever he wanted to do later on. Wanda was reading endlessly to Ted from almost the time he could sit long enough for her to listen. She wasn't reading children's books. She was reading articles out of Scientific American to him before he was 5 and explaining those to him. That gives you a flavor of. And he was obviously bright, and that reinforced her dedication. Very smart, high IQ guy. But she had this strong child focus, accompanied by a strong background anxiety in the form of fears that his social development was severely lagging. Wanda was quite involved with David as well, but her investment in him was less riddled with anxiety. I just put in a little plug here for a book I'm currently reading called How to Tame a Fox. Some of you may have heard of this research. The book is fascinating. These Russian geneticists set out, they started the project, I think, in the early 70s to see if they could take silver foxes, which are reasonably closely related to wolves, and through breeding experiments, tame them and domesticate them, basically was the goal. Could they become like dogs? And bottom line, over 20 years, they did. Took on a tremendous number of characteristics similar to the dogs. And the scientific thinking about how this happened is very interesting. But there's a chapter on family life in the middle of the book where the lead on the boots on the ground researcher, she was married, had kids of her own and a husband, but she spent a lot of time on site with the dogs, built a very small house for herself, and she was, after 3 generations or 4, she wanted to bring one of these foxes in, a tame one, to live with her in this house, wondering what would be the impact of the human on shaping domestication of the fox, not just the inbreeding for tameness. They also did controls inbreeding for wildness. But anyway, the stuff in that chapter about how these dogs attached to the humans, and once the humans were available to him, the dogs, foxes, the strength of this emotional attachment, you see it in a dog, but you then were seeing it in these foxes, which 3 generations earlier were just totally aggressive to humans. And there's a lot of interesting talk about how this happened so quickly. but it just shows the power of emotion, the emotional system, I think, in shaping behavior and shaping the connection between two individuals. And this was definitely the case with these two. As I said, Ted Sr. and David were part of this process. And Ted later wrote in some of his journals that he remembered life in the family being pretty good until he was around age 10 or 11. And he also wrote that he was unaware that he became relatively solitary from 8 years old on. He didn't really remember it started that early. And it's interesting that Ted's self-observation jives with comments that his aunt, Wanda's sister here, made before. She said, quotes, "Before David was born, Teddy was different. He used to snuggle up to me, but afterwards became withdrawn and different. Maybe we paid too much attention to the new baby," meaning David. So that's roughly the time that Wanda was pregnant and had David. And I give a paragraph here about a Bowen theory perspective on that sometimes. When a mother is very involved with one kid, and she may delay having the second kid out of anxiety about being able to meet the needs of both, because the programmed need for attention in this kid, and you read about that in the Hidden Life, in the How to Tame a Fox, and whether she could meet adequately his needs as well as the needs of the new baby. And that could have played a role in the delay in having the second child. In point of fact, the child is programmed and would be very sensitive to a disruption of any kind in the diversion of energy to the younger boy, and could have easily played a factor in his withdrawal. Now, one thing I want to add here, one of the major downsides to the anxiety about trauma that Wanda carried is that it's based on the idea that something bad happened in the past. And to a parent, typically the only recourse in the present is to shower the child with love and attention in the hope of countering the effects of the perceived trauma. And she did a lot of that. Such an approach, though, only further intensifies the fusion between Wanda and Ted, further increasing his need to rely on others to regulate his internal distress, not develop a self. The interactive process programs the child's needs for attention and acceptance far beyond what's adaptive in life. And so from a Bowen theory perspective, it's the programming and not the trauma that made it difficult for Ted to have a long-term relationship with a woman. And we'll revisit that. Ted blames his mother for not teaching him necessary social skills to successfully form a romantic relationship. Furious at her, hates her, eventually just wanted her out of his life, blaming her lack of skill in transmitting these skills to him. And as I said, I think earlier, he perceives himself to be unattached to his mother, as I'll describe later when he gets with an adult female potential romantic relationship. The intensity of the focus and fusion is powerful. And I'm absolutely convinced fusion is a far better explanation for what happens in the adult relationship than trauma. The fusion programs both a powerful need for emotional reinforcement and heightened reactivity to the perception of any sign of rejection and disparagement. Those were key for Ted. So again, the unresolved attachment here unfolds in the parental triangle. Besides Wanda's supporting and anxious focus on Ted, Ted's father was siding with her around major tensions during Ted's adolescence. He would take her side, and it got pretty nasty, according to Ted, during adolescence. I'll come back and speak to that again in a minute. But he had the father's own hypersensitivity to discomfort in Ted. For example, the father would take his sons along when he hunted. When Ted's father killed a rabbit, Ted had such a violent reaction that Ted's father gave up the sport rather than upset his son. As a young adult, Ted hated noise. Consequently, Ted Sr. gave up watching the television news when his son was home. David is quoted as saying, "There are certain things you can do and things you cannot do without creating further upset. Peace at any price" is the way I read that, and that's part of the problem, not part of the solution. But many parents are kind of pushed into that position out of their own not wanting to deal with the anxiety of any conflict between them and the child. So the focused on child's moods can upset other family members, rendering them increasingly passive. And this is taking the easy way out, can program the offspring to have unrealistic expectations about what others should do for him or her. In his case, a certain arrogance about what's right and holding others responsible for his or her happiness. So another way of expressing this is that the family learned to normalize Ted's aberrant behaviors. I think it was David who said we wove it into the family fabric, which is a phrase I like. And this is the kind of thing that keeps an emotional process hidden. The family doesn't really appreciate the significance of what's going on. It's hidden in that sense. But then an emotional regression began in the family when Ted reached the age of about 11, and I'm not sure exactly what triggered that. But prior to that, in pre-adolescence, there's this emotional distance between the parents, a very intense emotional fusion between Wanda and Ted, largely of a positive tone. An intense fusion with David as well, but I show it just 3 lines instead of 4, a less intense emotional fusion. Important interactions between Ted and David. David kind of looking up to Ted, and Ted being a big brother to him. And the father generally had pretty positive relationships with both kids. The father did. But an emotional regression began to unfold in the family, according to Ted, from about age 11 on. And no doubt a number of processes converged, ones that affected Ted directly and ones that affected other family members directly. Because there are outside factors affecting everybody, but the key understanding of rejection is how people are dealing with each other in face of each other's anxiety. That's what escalates it. The nature of the interaction sort of takes over and escalates independent of the initial stresses on the system. So now we know that the transition from elementary school to junior high school can be difficult for kids, particularly those who feel socially insecure, as he did. And the whole school routine changes in a way that can be overwhelming and isolating. So that transition to junior high school and then high school was definitely a stressor for Ted. And dealing with the peer groups, they played a role in this. So Ted dates the development of his anger back to that early adolescent period. And he's well aware of his anger. In a letter to his mother in the summer of 1991, he claims the many rejections, humiliations, and other painful influences during adolescence at home and in school caused his current difficulties. This comes from a Post article. Ted had tested in the genius IQ level and excelled through 5th grade and really all through school. That was his thing. The teachers recommended that he skip 6th grade, which the parents went along with. However, things did seem to change for him from 7th grade forward. During his adolescence, Ted spent more and more time by himself in the attic bedroom, especially when company came to the house. David goes on to describe Ted as already having developed rigid and dogmatic opinions. There was no way to change his mind about much of anything. But forensic psychiatrists who examined Ted in connection with the trial quoted Ted as saying, "By the time I left high school, at age 16, having skipped his junior year as well, I was definitely regarded as a freak by most students." Ted left high school with a low social esteem, in his own words. Left high school with a low social esteem. His social confidence was crushed, he said, during those years. But high self-esteem in other respects. He was confident in his ability to deal with things as opposed to people. He had no confidence in his ability to be accepted by people. So the changes, this became much more conflictual, and there was more irritation and conflict in the relationship between Ted and his mother. So there was just a lot more anxiety and a little less in David, who was a little more outside of it. But this was a regressive period till the time he left for college. So Ted headed off to Harvard in the fall of 1978 at age 16. In the Post article in 1996, the journalist says he reports that when he was accepted there, his parents' pride was tempered by apprehension. They feared he might not be able to cope with his erratic moods so far from home, and put some pressure on him in a way to stay closer, but really also wanted him to get to Harvard. And he seemed confused. They seemingly, in other words, recognized Ted's dependence on them to regulate his emotions. When the father took Ted on a trip to visit a few of the colleges he was interested in, Ted had what the dad called a melancholic shutdown, which would have reinforced their apprehension. Can he make this transition? Interestingly, he did. But I couldn't find the exact quote in his writing when I went back and looked for it. I know it's in there. It's maddening. I can't find it. But Ted had his own reservations about leaving for college. He had no clear goals for himself, little sense of direction that his life might take. I forget the words he used to describe that, but I interpret this as made by someone who grew up so much in reaction to his family that he had little solid self. Ted later described his home as an unhappy one, and that his social isolation came about because his parents pushed him too hard. But blaming one's parents, of course, blinds the adult child to his contribution to the problematic family interactions. Nonetheless, Ted adapted reasonably well at Harvard. The Atlantic Monthly article by Alston Chase in June of 2000 quotes Sally Johnson, a forensic psychiatrist who did a pre-trial examination of Ted. And her conclusion was Ted has intertwined two belief systems: that society is bad and he should rebel against it, and the other is his intense anger at his family's perceived injustices. And she stated, I put this in here because she said it started at Harvard. She adds further, during his college years, he had fantasies of living a primitive life and being an agitator, rousing mobs to frenzies of revolution. That was in his fantasy life. He encountered among faculty there highly polarized debate. On the one hand, science and technology was a threat to Western value and human survival, and on the other hand, that science was a liberator from superstition and an avenue to progress. And Ted definitely warmed up to the side of science and technology were a real threat to Western values. And that exposure at Harvard no doubt helped reinforce his later acting out his revenge on people involved in science and technology. Ted graduated from Harvard in 1962, June. And that fall went to do more graduate work in mathematics at Michigan. He got his PhD in mathematics in the spring of 1967. But it was at Michigan he decided that he could escape the periods of deep despair that he would experience, particularly related to the inability to connect with a female, by really killing someone. He made up his mind, I can do this. He didn't do it at that point, but there's a very poignant description of him walking across the Michigan campus and coming to that conclusion and feeling his despair lifted. I know what I'll do. I'll get revenge. I will kill somebody. And another journalist quoted him as saying, committing crimes that he did made him feel better. He was still angry about the perceived injustices he had suffered, but the difference was that he was able to strike back to a degree. The dynamic seems very clear. Getting revenge as a way of dealing with one's despair. A strange way of coping, but there it is. He became an assistant professor of mathematics at UC Berkeley after he left Michigan, but resigned that after less than 2 years, seemingly becoming less enamored of mathematics as a field or teaching it. And he was not a popular teacher. He insulated himself quite a bit during his time there. So he returns back to Chicago after he quits at Berkeley and moves in with his parents. David was away at college at Columbia at that point. Over the next 2 years, he then followed the pattern of many young adults, only it was delayed until after getting his PhD and a brief stint in academia. It sometimes happens that way. The liftoff problem. Ted and his parents living together generated a lot of anxiety between the three of them, reminiscent of what happened in my own family when my brother came back home. And so everybody was getting more anxious over those 2 years. Ted was spending a lot of time alone, and his parents were pushing him to find some work. He would find menial jobs, but then quit them without telling his parents. Again, all consistent with a guy who has no life direction, which I would relate to the lack of self. He wanted to live in a remote area. He tried to buy land in Canada, but that didn't go through. And then he eventually left his house, his parents' house, and not even planning to say goodbye. His mother saw him going out the door. He wasn't going to say a word and pleaded with him to stay, but he left. So in June 1971, David and Ted, still on pretty good terms, bought the 1.4 acre lot in Lincoln, Montana, near Lincoln, that area. And he built the cabin, the small cabin on the land, and moved into it in January 72. The cabin had no running water or electricity, and he lived as a recluse and learned survival skills to become self-sufficient. He did a pretty good job with that in the beginning. And for nearly 5 years, he lived rather peacefully there. His parents and brother both sent him money that primarily supported him. And this roughly 5-year period was very interesting. In the Post article, the writer quotes from one of Ted's journals, a letter written to his mother, saying, "He is always under stress whenever he is around people, except those he has known for a long time." And that's not always true with his family. The reason is that he doesn't feel that people will accept him. This fear of rejection, based on bitter experience both at home and at school, has ruined my life, except for the few years that I spent alone in the woods there in Montana. And in reading that journal of his, I mean, he was pretty serene and optimistic and settled, having tight controlled access over who he was going to see, and the family would come when he wanted them to come, and that kind of thing, which was infrequent. But being largely out of contact with people. I mean, it's almost painful to read how anxious he was around people. And that's a period in the middle 70s, and he did not make any bombs or even think about killing people at that point. But then things changed. Airplanes started flying overhead more frequently. Logging trucks were coming in, logging roads, more noise, more people living nearby, especially in the summers. And in his writing, you can just see him begin to give up on ever escaping the madness he saw as being wreaked on society by science and technology. So for 3 or 4 years, maybe 5, he felt safe and had no impulse to kill people, although he had decided he could do that earlier. And then as he gets this sense of being hemmed in, things begin to change for him. There was nowhere to go where he could feel safe. This attitude and feeling state seems key in finally his deciding finally to seek revenge by actually killing people. He had also claimed that he was acting on principle in killing people, involved in destroying civilization. The more dominant motivation, however, and this really jumped out on me in this review, seemed to be to express anger and hatred, to break free of any moral constraints, and to exact revenge for the injustices he had suffered, and having had the miserable parents, as he would call them, that he had. Blame, blame, blame. So about this time, the family was getting tired of sending him money. And when he wanted more money, they put pressure on him for him to come home again and get a job and live with them again. And he did do that. He came back to Chicago for about a year, went to work in a factory that his father managed, and David was his immediate boss. His first bombing attempt, which was not successful, at Northwestern University, occurred very soon after he returned to Chicago, where, again, he remained for almost a year. So I think that's change in social context, again, believing there's no place to run, no place to hide, and being back in the middle of his family, played a big role in the bombings starting then. His work with his father and David lasted only a few months, An incident occurred with a woman who worked at the same company that highlights Ted's core vulnerability. He went out on a few dates with this woman, but she decided not to go out anymore. And given Ted's sensitivity to rejections and automatic tendency to blame others, he posted derogatory notes about this woman at the workplace. This was typical for him when he get involved with a woman. It would just, anxiety would just take over, and misinterpretation of what was going to happen, etc. Totally lost in the relationship, which I would see as his lack of self. The brother fired him. Ted was angry at his brother for doing that. And he then, within a few months, made the second bombing attempt. While still in Chicago, he did get another job briefly. But again, he failed to kill anyone. And that was also at Northwestern. Then he went back to Montana. And between November 1979 and April 1995, he conducted 14 more bombings that resulted in 3 deaths. He mailed bombs that had become more sophisticated, and unwittingly, the parents were sending him money still that was reinforcing, and they're supporting his bombing efforts. Then 3 important family events occurred. David's marriage in 1990, Ted's diagnosis of cancer, Ted Sr.'s metastatic lung cancer, September 90, his death from the self-inflicted gunshot wound a month later, and then David's marriage that resulted in more distance between him and David, which was already increasing. Ted didn't go to his dad's funeral, didn't express much at all about it to anybody. But during the 80s, late 80s and into the 90s, life was becoming, as a hermit, was becoming bleaker. He was very short on money, as there was little work for him, particularly during the winter. It is interesting that there were no bombing attempts during this period. And I've wondered if he just wasn't drifting back into despair. And he was seeking therapy at that point, still hoping to figure out a way somebody could explain to him how to connect with a female. He had befriended a man, and they became pen pals. I think this started with a connection David had. And in those letters, Ted expressed a lot of understanding, very bright guy, and compassion for this man, illuminating another side of Ted. He also tried to establish a therapy relationship, as I said, but that never worked out. So to summarize this, the bombings that then resumed in 93, there were 2 more, and then he was planning another one when he was captured, and that was September. The manifesto he published in September 95. People speculate why he did that, and it was arrested about 6 months later. Now, a brief summary, and then we'll open it up for the discussion. For me, the principal take-home message in this case, and the other cases that I'll present in this section, is that Ted's lower basic level of differentiation related to an intense and unresolved attachment to his family, largely denied, most intensely manifesting in the relationship with his mother, is the most important factor that rendered him vulnerable to a severe emotional dysfunction of some type. And the most obvious evidence of his lack of self is his inability to form a romantic relationship with a woman, and for any length of time. He tried many times, but all the relationships became unstable to the point of disruption very rapidly. His intense focus on a potential partner, malignant levels to perceived reactivity to perceived signs of rejection and blaming of the other person, all reflect his emotional programming, created by the intense fusion in which he developed. And again, reading about these foxes, forming attachments. It was just real interesting to see how deeply emotional this stuff is in the evolutionary sense. So his intense anger and blaming of his mother and father to reflect his unresolved fusion and his cause and effect thinking. As I said earlier, the forensic psychiatrist Sally Johnson diagnosed him as having paranoid schizophrenia, but I fail to see that that adds anything to the understanding of Ted's dysfunction. I think her earlier quoted statement about Ted intertwining two belief systems, society is bad and he should rebel against it, and a malignant level of anger at his family for perceived injustices, hit the nail. Intertwining those, fusing those, Bowen theory would call it, hit the nail right on the head. And I would say from the perspective of Bowen theory, that intertwining is not a disease, but more of a condition that reflects an anxiety-driven fusion between his emotional and intellectual systems, which of course would be on a continuum. So exacting revenge by attempting to kill other people was his way of coping with anxiety-driven despair and anonymity. It is very interesting that when he was able to reduce the threat of contact with others who could affect him adversely, referring here to that fairly calm period during the middle 1970s, he did not try to kill anyone. Although the awareness that he could kill came in the late 60s, he did not act on it until he felt that no escape was possible from the societal events that were connected to his demons, that would trigger his demons. Okay, I'm sorry it took a little longer than I expected, commonly does, but I'll stop with that and we'll have about a half hour here.
So if you at the sites would go ahead and turn on your video and please communicate in the chat room when you have a question or a comment that you'd like to make.
I imagine some of you never heard me present that before. Some of you have. I hope it was useful to revisit that for those of you who've heard me talk about it. Again, I think it's these kind of cases that are so puzzling to the public that I think Bowen theory offers the best explanation we have at this point. Okay, well, we'll open it up and see who steps forward here. Okay, I can't read that very well.
A question from Michigan.
Okay, a question from Michigan. It sounds not on. I got it.
Okay, an article that came across my feed, and I don't know if it's true, but it says an extreme psychological study may have affected a young Ted Kaczynski at Harvard. So just because that's new information, I don't know, you might know it. You would have to address it according to Bowen Family Systems, and this doesn't. They're kind of saying that study drove him crazy.
Yeah, that was
okay.
An Atlantic Monthly article.
Oh, it was already, okay.
Yeah, in which I did read that article. And yeah, this was a study, I think it took place for over a year, maybe close to 2 years, in the atmosphere that I was describing earlier of this polarization in the academic community over science and technology are threatening our survival versus that's our only path forward and to save our species. That was a big polarized debate. And so that thing would challenge, I think the basic idea was that they would vigorously challenge a person's beliefs. And
right.
And so this guy theorized that Met may have played a part in shaping what Ted did. And I think it could have an influence. It certainly reinforced ideas that he had was beginning to develop already I don't know how well developed they were at that point, but David, when I met with him and his wife, when we had dinner together that night, the first day of my visit, he said, you know, what Ted was against and wanting to stop is very much something our family supported. None of us just felt justified in going out and killing anybody over it. So I think it was there before, but clearly I think Harvard, that atmosphere could have reinforced it in some way. Well, thanks for pointing that out.
Okay.
I did see
That
that.
was all. Okay.
Vancouver.
Okay, apparently we got Vancouver next.
Mike, I was just struck from your presentation. We had a couple.
Can you adjust your camera so you're visible?
It is you. I thought it sounded like you. Now we know it's you for sure.
That's reassuring. Anyway, I was just saying that I thought your presentation was unusually compelling. That the theoretical concepts, when juxtaposed with the facts of functioning over this man's life and his mother's, just kind of has an explanatory power that is compelling. And I'm just, there's no answer to this question, but how is it that that the capacity of the theory to explain facts in this kind of presentation doesn't receive a wider audience and appreciation for its importance? I mean, you could line up some of the things you described about the family profile and his profile and just see how in every instance it places him at one end of a continuum that can be described in lesser degrees with other people and families. I don't know, it's just a combination of being impressed by the power of the presentation juxtaposed against the lack of appreciation for it more largely.
If you do me a favor and answer a question for me, and then I'll respond. Do you think there was too much detail in there? Did you get lost in detail, or was it okay?
I thought it was fine. I thought it added to the power of the presentation and made it as compelling as I found it.
Well, thanks. I was trying to bring this guy alive in a way and show that this is a complex human being, and I was surprised when Sally Johnson called him paranoid schizophrenic. I mean, definitely a paranoid can have a delusion, but Ted didn't exactly have a delusion. He took a side that many people take, that science and technology has harmed the planet, what people have done with it. And that's a legitimate point of view that many people support. But so I wouldn't exactly call that a delusion. I'd just call it a dogmatically held belief. But the thing that really seemed to fire him was this desire for revenge. And I think that's probably true with a lot of these murderers. I've just been reviewing stuff on Gilmore, and revenge is huge for Gilmore. Different set of circumstances, but that revenge is his anger at supposed injustices. And it hardly fits the criteria which you normally think about for schizophrenia, I believe, but it has some seeming connection to it. But that's what I was trying to do, is just to try to bring out the complexity of his character and some of the processes that seem to feed into the actions he took. Without believing I can explain or could have predicted this particular outcome. I mean, why didn't he just go out and kill himself in his despair? But he just wasn't particularly wired that way, I guess. I don't know how to make sense out of that. Okay, well, Gary, Randy, thanks for your comments. And now we go to KC, okay, in Kansas City.
You kind of touched on this just a minute ago, but I wonder if you could say a little bit.
Can't hear you too well.
No? Okay. Let me try to get a little closer.
Okay.
Okay. How about now?
I can hear you better.
Okay. So I'm thinking about one of the things as a society that I think people are trying to grapple with is how to prevent things like this from happening, how to prevent people from getting to the point that they commit a bunch of murders, or that you have a serial killer or a mass murderer out in society. Do you think that Bowen theory offers anything in terms of prevention? Because one of the things that I'm thinking about is that there could be another family that presents very similarly to the Kaczynski family, and another child in that same functional position that, for example, just lives in their parents' basement and plays video games the rest of their life, or, as you just mentioned, kills themselves. What do you think Bowen theory offers in terms of that idea of prevention, if anything?
Yeah, there's a paragraph or two at the end of this chapter I have been trying to put together. I haven't finished. I just have two things to say about it. One was before the trial, back in, I don't know, 96 or early 97 maybe, 60 Minutes did about a 14-minute clip with Mrs. Kaczynski, David, and Wanda, and Mike Wallace and Leslie Stahl interviewed these two folks, this family. And Wallace said to Mrs. Kaczynski, well, didn't you see anything wrong with Ted when he was growing up that was enough to alert you that maybe he needed some kind of special help? And I loved her answer. She said, well, there was nothing gross. I got a kick out of her choice because there were definitely family tensions. But what's the point? What's the difference between a family that decides to seek help for that and a family that just doesn't do that? And my family did not seek help for my brother, even though it was recommended by a sixth grade teacher that maybe he was a pretty insecure, shy kid who could use some therapy. My parents went to see the person who they were referred to, and the person said, yes, I think maybe it would be good for your son to have some therapy for a period of time. I think I can help him. And mother reports to me later walking out of that office with dad and saying, oh gosh, we can never do that to Billy. It would just so deflate whatever self-esteem he has if he has to be in therapy. And that's the way they decided not to do it. So in a way, it doesn't surprise me that during those adolescent years that were definitely anxious times for the family. And David faults Ted for having a different memory of things than he had. And again, I can match that with my experience. I knew there was crap going down in my family, but it wasn't that much of a burden for me. But for my brother, he was in the middle of the triangle. It was a big deal. But that was their reason for not seeking help. So certainly people have to seek it. And then the point at which they really could have used a hand, I think, is when he came back from resigning at Berkeley, and he came home for 2 years, and it was a very tense household. Had they sought help at that point with somebody who understood the family dynamics, because I don't think anybody was going to talk Ted out of his positions. He seemed pretty adamant about what he thought about things. But maybe the parents, maybe the dad, maybe the mother, maybe David's influence, I don't know, could have had an ability to help the family recognize what an anxious state they're in, and that is playing a big role in their son's actions and decision making. Now, just by getting somebody in the family who can see that, they can reduce the anxiety and I think create an environment in which the dysfunctional one has a little better chance of trying to assemble a life, but no guarantees there. When they get to be this intense, they're just very hard. But I've worked with a lot of families like that, and sometimes you get through and a parent will take some responsibility for I am an anxious person here. I'm making this worse for my son and my wife. I've got to get my act together. And he can be a little bit more of a self, particularly to his wife, and that can help her, and that can both can then work at the anxiety and not have it so dictate their interactions. Because the family has to see and believe how they're interacting with the son or daughter is playing a part in the here and now in making it worse. I remember a couple I saw twice. And at the second session, they had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The girl was living in another city, doing reasonably well, but both sons were struggling. One with a lot of depression, and the other quite symptomatic. I forget the deal there. But the one with the depression was getting outpatient shock therapy twice a week. And so it was a big deal. And then in the second session, I thought I'm going to try to help the parents see if they could actually become a resource to their kids. And to do that, they would have to own their own anxiety and its impact. And so when I forget how I went about it, but I just asking question, what's it like when you and your sons get together, either individually or together? And the father said, well, my wife, she just goes into a certain, I don't know if we call it anxious mode, but kind of frenzied mode of questioning them and wanting some explanation for them and just ziz, ziz, ziz. And he says, I can see my son shut down in face of that. And then when I turned to the wife and said, what do you think about that? She said, my son is in electroconvulsive therapy twice a week. You expect me not to be anxious about that? Something to that effect. And they never came back. I never saw him again. I mean, it can be hard to get through, but certainly the theory can lay out, as Randy Frost just talked about, what's happening here, and to provide a window for one of the 2 parents. In this case, it wasn't going to be Ted for sure, although I wouldn't be against seeing Ted if he wanted to come in on his own. Certainly I would work with him, try to help him with this thing with the female, but for him to control that or even accept that would be. So I think the theory's there, but it's not always easily applied. But other families have had some success with that, even at fairly low level stuff. Okay, well, I'll stop with that. I hope that's helpful. It doesn't sound pessimistic. Okay, we're still with Margaret. Okay, Margaret, go ahead.
I just had 2 questions. One was the value, sort of reiterating what Randy said, the value of presenting the whole family and the whole person. I know when I first worked at a mental health center, I went to the psychologist, supervised me. I said, well, I saw my first murderer. And she said, well, he was a hell of a nice guy, wasn't he? And I said he was. And then to your second point, I have a case where the son is fluidly psychotic, but the mother read one of your articles on the website. I referred her to that in case she was interested. And then she came back in and she seemed to like get it. She said, oh, I get it. It's too much. It's not like I'm not doing enough. I'm doing too much. And she said, my husband doesn't get that it's too much. I got to talk to him about doing too. And she sort of like got it. And he's done remarkably well, but I think it's because of her ability to pierce that perception she had. Anyway, just 2 comments.
Yeah, you never know when somebody is going to hear something. I think this was in Chicago a few years ago. The other distinguished guest lecturer that they brought in took an interest in what Bowen theory people there were saying about anxious over-involvement with the kids. And when the meeting was ending and we were giving him a ride back to the hotel or something, he said, when I go home and get home tonight, I'm going to tell my wife she's too anxiously over-involved with this kid of ours. I don't know what his weekend was like, but but you can't do it that way either, for sure. But yeah, because a mother maybe sees it, then the husband can get very nervous if she stops doing what she was doing. And tell me about it. I'll tell you about it in my own life. And that the change takes some courage, and you have to sort of really buy the idea to follow through, for sure. So thanks, Margaret. Okay, Kathy Kerr, I guess, is next.
So I don't know whether I can say this well or not, but I was struck with, anger and resentment is so in this. And I think theory suggests that is fueled by the youngster coming up against parents with no self, no boundaries, no limits, and that the child doesn't bounce up against something solid, and so this anger builds and builds. And so I was struck with the phrase that came to mind when you were talking about the way they dealt with his upsets was that they like folded themselves around him and turned themselves inside out. And I believe that is connected with the engendering of anger, and that Bowen theory has a different way of understanding the genesis of anger than trauma or neglect or whatever. So that was my comment. I don't know how well I can say it.
Well, I think you said it well. I think that another way to phrase it would be the anger comes out of the triangle. It's not a characteristic of the individual. It reflects the inability of any one of the 3 central people being unable to maintain a self with the other. And I think that adds a good point that I didn't emphasize. Okay, we'll go to San Diego.
San Diego doesn't have it.
And that's CJ down there.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. Missed them. Morgan.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, so since we're on the topic of what does Bowen theory have to offer to families like this, was just curious, it sounded like you were able to kind of get on the inside with this family and talk with his mother and build a sort of relationship of trust with them, I guess. Just the question then, does the mother have any sense now that she did contribute to this, or that her over anxious posture was fueling some of Ted's problems? Did you ever get through to her to that extent?
Well, it was just a Saturday, all day Saturday, and then Saturday night at dinner. Wanda didn't go with us to dinner, but then I think half a day Sunday before I flew back. So there wasn't a lot of time. I tell this story often. As I was leaving, Mrs. Kaczynski said to me, Dr. Kerr, do you think there's anything I could have done differently that would have prevented this? And I don't even remember exactly what I said, but I didn't say anything all that clear. But I thought on the way back on the plane, I should have said, well, you could have been a different person. And that's not blaming anybody. She was just being herself, a dedicated mother, but very, very anxious. And might she be capable? Might Linda be capable? Might David be capable of seeing the role of anxiety in the system? Who knows? I've been fooled a lot with people who get it or people who don't get it, where I couldn't predict. But so I can't say that. I had a very nice note from David after my time there saying that he thought it helped their mother a lot. It may have been the neutrality of it all, just taking the edge off. I don't know, that this is not a pathological family. This is just a family that's more like other families than different. It was in my family. I think they appreciated that. So in that sense, it was a good connection. But if she wanted to have continued sessions, I mean, the thing that bothered them, and I had the crazy idea, maybe I could be of help in reducing this cutoff between the family and Ted, because Ted was refusing to see his family, had been for a number of years, and then at the trial, at the first time they saw him in the courtroom, the trial never really got underway, but he refused to look at them. David was sitting just maybe 8 feet back, and Ted's, all he could see was Ted's back. His mother was there, and Ted never turned around. And that really bothered the family a lot. Because as David said, I really care about my brother. And but I was wondering, dealing with David, could I perhaps help reduce this cutoff? It was, I think, naive on my part, because I think anything I said to him about the family, he quickly reinterpreted in his own way. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. And I'm getting the signal here. We're getting short on time, but
We should take Randy's comment.
okay. I guess we're going to finish with Randy. You got the last word, Randy. What?
We're out of time.
Yeah. Just a quick thought.
259 on the thing there.
Yeah. Just a quick thought on the idea of predictability. You know, if the orientation of the family is toward blaming the outside, something outside self for problems, as opposed to blaming self or blaming members of the family for problems, that might be one diagnostic way to distinguish whether the lack of differentiation is going to erupt outwards or turn inwards on a family member. Just a thought.
Okay, thank you, Randy, very much. Okay, thank you one and all, and we have one more in July, and I'll see you in June. I mean, I'll see you in June.